Hi everyone, welcome. Good to see you all. I think that's everyone in the waiting room, so maybe we can go ahead and get started.
Sure, yeah.
Um, well, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Zach Sheets. I'm with both Duo Axis and the Community Music Center of Boston. This is my colleague Wei Han Wu.
Hello, everybody. My name is Wei-Han Wu. I currently live in DC. It's a pleasure to be here in Boston and also at CMCB, where we're currently Zooming from. Had a great a week so far, working with Zach and then working with some of our composer guests.
And we're also thrilled to have Ben Hyers here, who is the CEO of the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, who's going to help us facilitate our Q&A and some questions at the end. A little agenda for today. This is going to be really informal. We just did some introductions. We're going to start by talking about our colleague Tanya Ko and some of her work. And we'll hear from her in an interview that we recorded the other day. And then we'll share an interview that we did with Anthony Chang and some of his work and his upcoming projects. And then we will play a little excerpt of his piece. We're going to play both of them in our recital on Thursday here at Community Music Center of Boston. It's both in person in Allen Hall and streamed online. And then we'll have just kind of an open conversation. As you'll see, the interviews with Tanya and Anthony, they talk a lot about identity, artistry, inspiration. They're two of the smartest and most interesting people we know. So I think it'll be a really fruitful conversation, and we're looking forward to hearing from you all in the second half of our time with your questions and thoughts. So first, we'll look at Tanya, and we'll play you a short excerpt actually of a studio recording we made of a piece of hers that she wrote for us, one in a series of works for instrument plus piano. It's kind of an unusual one. We're seated back to back at the piano actually, and there's a choreography to it where we're moving as well as playing and breathing. Anything else?
Yeah, you could probably see that the title of the piece, Reaction, which is also Axis 3, which is part of a series of pieces, Axis 1, Axis 2. And the time when we first worked on this piece, we actually didn't have a name yet. This is just a funny little anecdote. And we were like going back and forth trying to figure out like what would be an appropriate name for a duo like this. Like what? Like some random object plus a number behind it, like, I don't know, Matchbox 20, what is it, Matchbox 26 or whatever the group name was. But anyway, we were really taken by Tonya's piece, and we was like, why don't we call ourselves Duo Axis? So this piece sort of inspired our duo name as well.
Yeah. All right, so we'll play like maybe a 2-minute excerpt to start. as you can see, it's quite an unusual work, but we find like quite a thrilling one in a lot of ways. And when we first got it, we really weren't sure actually what to do with it in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
it's very unusual.
Especially the whole thing, it tends to like land really well with audiences.
Yeah, I think so. I think, when you've seen past performances with the flutist and the pianist, the flutist up in front, sort of the center set up for like a recital. But Tanya was trying to think really outside of the box. She thought about like, pianists usually we don't need to breathe to play our instruments. It's like, well, what if she incorporated breathing and movement into part of what I do at the piano as well. And she sort of imagined us duo as like one entity moving back and forth. So it's rather unusual. Yeah.
Let's hear a little interview with Tanya. We spoke with her for about 10 minutes a couple days ago just to get some of her thoughts on her work and her career and life and all kinds of things. Maybe to start, is there something you'd like to tell people about this piece that we're going to play?
Sure. So this piece is entitled Reaction Axis 3, and it's the third in my series of pieces for instrument plus piano that deal with various physical axes, and this one is the most explicit in that concept. So the axis is one of movement, and it's all about the physical gestures of playing piano and playing flute. And so I've tried to link up the two performers so that they are moving in a reciprocal way. So basically when the movement of breath, like exhaling, is moving forward and down, and inhaling, moving backwards and up, that's mapped onto the pianist playing as well. So I really wanted to create a duo that goes beyond the idea of the notes and rhythms aligning together, but actually the bodies of the musicians are lined up.
It's very cool. I remember during the workshop, the working on the piece process was a very unique and different experience working with you and coordinating our bodies and to make the piece become visually stimulating as well as orally. And I remember also, in listening and then watching some of your other pieces, I was always very struck by how outside of the box they are. You incorporate a lot of different oral and visual elements in your music. And I'm just curious, like, what are some of the inspirations perhaps that come to you when you're thinking about, you're writing a new piece for this commission or starting a new artistic process?
Sure. So I think in my work, the sense of touch is really important. So in the piece that you're playing, it's about touching each other, I guess, like being in contact with each other as a musical duo. And I think the tactile sense also influences how I treat the instruments. So I think a lot about how musicians touch and hold their instruments. And I almost imagine like taking a magnifying glass, like writing music that really magnifies a certain process, whether it's like the way the fingers put down the keys on wind instruments, or the amount of speed and pressure that a string player might negotiate. So there's that kind of conceptual side. I think on the more general side of inspiration, I think being from Hawaii, I'm just like constantly thinking about the ocean. It's something that I really missed, when I lived in the Midwest. And the movement of the Pacific Ocean is just something that recurs a lot in my music.
What would you say this is a bit of a funny way to ask it, but what would you say is your superpower as a composer? What's like a special thing that you think you can do that's like one of a kind or that's really distinctive that you know you've always honed and fostered that you're really good at?
I think my superpower is that I am able to incorporate an experimental perspective onto my works, yet I craft it in a way that still sounds really good. I think this balance of like experimentation and craft is something I am proud of. And for me, it's not a successful piece. You know, if it's something that incorporates for something very theatrical, like in your piece, it's not successful unless I've also dealt really well with melody and harmony and rhythm and all of that. Yeah, so this balance, I think it's a kind of like narrow path that I try to tread quite carefully.
Yeah, moving from like a very innovative concept, but then also to a successful execution of that concept as well. Yeah.
I have a question for you, but it's actually two-part.
Okay.
First, if I understand correctly, I'm an immigrant. I assume you're an immigrant yourself as well, right?
Twice over now.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about like, your growing up history, like, where were you born and then when did you move to the States and then now UK? And then the second part is that there's that stereotype that, a lot of immigrant families, they don't necessarily encourage their children to pursue, the humanities or the arts because, they understand that's a difficult path and, perhaps they like to steer their children towards a more lucrative, profession. I'm just curious, like for you growing up, do you feel like your environment was very supportive of your pursuit of composition, the arts, or you feel like you're more of a dark horse in that regard?
Okay. So the first part of the question, I was born in Hong Kong, and my whole family is from like Guangdong area. And I moved to Honolulu, Hawaii when I was 6. So I grew up in Hawaii, which was a very multicultural environment. I think Hong Kong and Hawaii are both multicultural in different ways. And after high school, I sort of lived all over the US, pursuing my studies for about 10 years. And in late 2019, I moved to London, which is where I am now. So I always joke when I meet people in the UK that I just took the long way to get there.
That's true.
Yeah.
Right, because a lot of people from Hong Kong move
They just moved directly to the
to
UK.
UK. That's right.
Just took a very long way to get there. Yeah, so that's my personal background. And in terms of my family, I'm the only musician in my family. And I would say only musician kind of including any amateur musicians. I think I have a couple cousins who dabbled with piano lessons, just very temporarily, but nobody plays music. My father is a film director, stage/film director and producer in Hong Kong. So there is arts thinking, particularly in my family in Hong Kong. But when I was growing up, I think, it wasn't very supported. I think my mom always knew that I really wanted to be a musician. And so she was actually very supportive, but sort of the wider family didn't really see it as, well, they just didn't really know what to make of it. I think, now that I am making a living as a composer, I'm like doing fine. It seems like they are more accepting of it, but never really gets talked about a lot because they don't really know enough about the field or what I go through to kind of talk about it. The other thing that still is a little bit difficult is the way my sister kind of has to like put on a front for me a little bit. Like she's a medical doctor, and so we make jokes like, "Oh, you're off the hook," because
Oh.
she's kind of like fulfilled the stereotype.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
I've been thinking a lot recently about these questions of like artistic mentorship and working with younger students, and keeping in mind that our conversation tonight is being co-presented by Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, which is a local nonprofit here in Boston, whose mission is to empower Asians and new immigrants to build healthy families and achieve greater economic success and contribute to thriving communities by providing a broad range of innovative and family-centered programs. I'm curious how you think about the arts now in a teaching position, and now, having navigated quite a number of communities along your path, how you think the arts can help support vibrant communities, or if you were, perhaps another way to ask it is thinking back to a younger version of yourself. Is there advice you would give to yourself, or something you would tell yourself about the influence or the importance of the arts on building vibrant neighborhoods and thriving communities of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the arts are just like a crucial way to create communities, I think anywhere. And in addition to teaching at Royal Holloway, I've also had the privilege to work with various summer festivals, including what's now called the Wildflowers Festival, which reaches out to women and non-binary young composers. Also at the Creative Lab at the National Concert Hall in Ireland, which has been really fun, and just bringing people from so many different backgrounds together for a love of many different types of music has been new and very rewarding for me to participate in. Your last question about what I would say to a younger version of me does have to do with community, which is that I would have encouraged a young Tonya to reach out and ask for help much more than I was willing to do when I was younger. There was a sense that I needed to make it on my own and just do everything on my individual efforts. And I think if I reached out for help, I would have certainly felt a lot less isolated, but also participated in creating more of a community around me. And I think efforts like the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center is making that happen, encouraging young people to help each other, support each other, and just create a more vibrant community.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I feel like sometimes we're not necessarily taught, but implied that, you have to work hard, work on, rely on your own merit. And, sometimes asking for help or using resources is sort of a sign of, inferiority or weakness. And then you feel like you gotta keep hitting the wall and hopefully rise above it. But, there are resources out there that's designed to help and connect with each other. And I had to learn that the hard way as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was really great. Thank you so much for speaking with us from across the ocean.
Thanks for having me.
It was lovely to see you, Tanya, and we're so excited to play your work on Thursday.
Thanks.
So, just thinking about the time, I wonder if we might just go right on into Anthony's?
Sure, yeah. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts or questions. Unfortunately, Tanya couldn't join us tonight because she currently lives in London, but we pre-recorded this. she's just a really lovely and generous person. And
If questions start coming to mind or comments, feel free to make use of the chat feature. And then, when we're talking later, if people want to jump in with raised hands for questions, would love to hear from you. Anthony is an artist who speaks on some similar topics, some different ones, equally poised and thoughtful and interesting fellow. So rather than us knuckleheads continuing to do Abbott and Costello here, we can go right over to Anthony. And I think he has a lot to share as well. So, thank you so much for joining us, Anthony. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Well, first, maybe could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're from, and where we are now here meeting today?
So we're here in Grant Recital Hall at Brown University, where I just had the pleasure of hearing you run through my piece, Axis Mundi, for the first time, and you're about to play it in a few days. And I teach at Brown University. I'm an associate professor of music, and I've been here, this is my second year teaching. Prior to here, I lived in Chicago, taught at the University of Chicago for about 7 years. And I'm originally from San Francisco. So I was born and raised in California, in the Bay Area. And I still consider myself more or less a West Coast person.
Cool. And anything in particular you'd like to share about your piece for the concert on Thursday?
Yeah, I think, well, the title, as I mentioned, is Axis Mundi. And that refers to kind of a center of the earth that is a kind of pole between heaven and earth, so celestial and earthly, where you have a lot of representations in visual art and in many early civilizations and many spiritual practices of Axis Mundi structures like columns or pagodas or mountains, and they're often thought of as having these kind of magical properties. And I was thinking about your name, of course, being duo axis, but also really thinking about this unique combination of the flute and the piano, and especially the context of the flute being this instrument that, from its very inception, has had kind of magical properties. I mean, the flute is the oldest instrument in existence, in human existence. It was used primarily in sacred contexts and ritualistic contexts. And so it's always been this kind of conduit of spirituality, of accessing a different world. And I was trying to get at that sensation in the piece, both in the sound quality of it and kind of transfer of the kind of vocalization into the writing, as well as how these two instruments complement one another.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about this project you're doing at the Ojai Festival in California. It's a work of 7 Asian American poets.
Yes.
Yeah, can you tell us more about it?
Sure. It's a piece called The Echoing of Tenses, and that's a line from a piece, from a poem by Jenny Xie, who is one of the poets that is being featured. Soon, I kept being drawn to certain poets who were dealing specifically with memory, and those poets turned out to be, by and large, Asian and Asian American. So it just made sense to find this constellation of voices that were intergenerational and all living and all Asian American. And so, but within their own worlds, quite different from one another. So you have a poet like Arthur Z, who is based in Santa Fe, who is in his 70s and a total master of the natural world, descriptions of the natural world. He's very attuned to ancient Chinese texts. He's actually done translations of Tang Dynasty poems, but he's brought that into our century, especially with his own personal surroundings. And then we also, so he will actually be at the Ojai Festival talking, reciting his poems as part of his piece.
Wow.
Another is Victoria Chang, who is a poet based in LA, and also she actually wrote an epistolary collection of poems called Dear Memory, which is fits right into this theme, and it talks a lot about her conversations or conversations she wished she had after the fact with members of her family, her grandparents, her parents, her friends, her mentors, drawing kind of deeply into the recesses of memory and bringing them into focus. It's a beautiful collection, and so she'll be with us as well. And then there are 5 other phenomenal poets. So
That's incredible. I'm curious, within the last perhaps couple years or 2-3 years, where the conversation about representation, equity, and empowering people from all different backgrounds is at the forefront of, in many different communities, including the arts community. And I wonder, as a person of Asian descent or Asian American, I wonder how that conversation perhaps has made you consider how your artistic process sort of fit within this larger conversation, or if that has made any changes or made us more aware.
yeah, it's something that I think about a lot, but I think especially in the last few years, because it's really important how we are considered and viewed within this larger arts community and environment and scene, and representation matters a whole lot. I think that especially as Asian American creative artists, as composers, that's an area of impact that is often misunderstood and often invisible in a way. Ocean Vuong actually has this incredible interview. He's one of the poets that I'm setting actually for this piece, but he has an incredible interview where he talks about how Asian American creative artists in particular, it's unfathomable in our American culture that such a thing could exist, because the image of an Asian American artist has been so tied to performing or reproducing, things in the Western canon or things from the past. And I think, could it be fathomable that we have an Asian American poet or an Asian American painter or composer? And those are things that I think about a lot. And then what kind of message do I want to convey as part of that? Taking into the complexities, all the complexities of who I am and my identity is in so many layers. And I think there's also a lot of expectations that a lot of people have. I've had people come up to me and say, well, I couldn't detect the Chineseness in that, or I couldn't, as if that was, there has to be some kind of strong sonic signifier, that is immediate as part of my identity, which I sometimes embrace, but identity is complicated, right? It's especially when you're Asian and born in America.
Right.
So I sometimes really want to push against those assumptions as well. So that's all to say that it's definitely something very much present, but not always active at a surface level. I think it's very deep and ingrained. Even growing up in San Francisco, which a third of its population is Asian American, so there's certainly no lack of exposure or seeing people who look like you, yet at the same time, it's hard to imagine, but there still is so much of this feeling of assimilation and conformity.
I just think it's such a complex issue in terms of identity and how much do I identify, and like you said, assimilation. I was born and grew up in Taiwan, but didn't come to the States in my teens. Tony-Ann came over when she was quite young, but you were born in the Bay Area. You were born in the States, so it just runs such a gamut in terms of people with Asian heritage, of how they relate to, their ethnic background, and that shaped their identity and how they view the world and their work. It's such a complex, but fascinating.
We need to have that conversation at some point. And so, but coming at different points in our lives changes everything, right? You have that total perspective that I never had, that I wish I had, and when I do go there, I feel totally outside as well, But being married to someone who grew up in China has totally shifted my perspective as well. And before the pandemic, we were going every year, and that I'm just so grateful for having the opportunity to see the world in a different way.
So finally, keeping in mind that tonight's event is co-presented by the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, and we have their executive director Ben Heyer is here, who's moderating. I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit about the importance of the arts for convening thriving communities, or perhaps thinking back to your own upbringing and your communities you grew up in, maybe advice you would have to yourself about the importance of the arts. The BCNC provides a whole suite of family services, economic empowerment, job and language training, but also through the POW Arts Center has a really important influence on artistic practice and artistic tradition as part of all of that. And so I'm wondering if you can speak on how that can help foster these really vibrant community connections.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, I think what you're doing is really incredible, and I can't imagine, I sometimes still think about how my parents, how they view this whole career and profession that I've gotten, this mess that I've gotten myself into, It's certainly not something that they ever could have envisioned, being immigrants coming to the U.S. and, at the same time, they somehow saw that it was important for me to get into the arts, but kind of to develop holistically as a well-rounded person, which I think is the most natural way to approach it. I mean, that's how so many of us get into it, and even if it isn't your calling in life, I think everyone deserves the opportunity to play music, to be in the arts, to be creative and explore. That should be a given right to everybody, and it's so often in our culture it's considered something extraneous or extracurricular, or we see it even in higher education. It's like something that is secondary and a little sprinkle of this or that, So I hope for a kind of totally integrated kind of approach and curriculum where arts are not secondary, where they are part of the fabric of everyday being and doing, and that we see it not as just an entertainment or as something that one does because everyone is doing it, but that you can really develop a love for something that sometimes turns into an obsession and turns into a career,
Right.
But knowing full well that that's not for everybody, but
There's a social emotional components to
Yeah.
your well-being.
I can't imagine my life without music. It totally, it got me through some tough times, and I saw playing piano certainly, but composing especially as an outlet for so many things that I couldn't express. Otherwise, I didn't know why I was having certain feelings. I didn't know why I was, at a really volatile moment, in adolescence, why I was feeling certain ways. But having that outlet for creativity just saved me, in a way. And I wish that for everyone.
Shall we play a little bit of Anthony's piece?
Let's play a little bit of Anthony's piece.
Let's play some music.
Cool.
Thursday, and you can get to hear the whole thing. It's fitting music, I think, from someone who described his two favorite composers as Maurice Ravel and Billy Strayhorn. Kind of a fun combination of things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Anthony couldn't join us tonight either because he and his wife, Lu Wang, they're in New York City because the New York Phil is playing music of theirs. So they're very busy people.
We got bumped out by the New York Philharmonic. Well, we were, yeah, you know,
as,
do what you can.
As one goes.
As one does. Right?
Yeah.
But Ben, would you like to join us for some questions and maybe some answers?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Lehan. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Hires, CEO of Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center. Very grateful to the Community Music Center of Boston and all of you for being here. I'm going to jump in. Thanks, for putting this on tonight in this, COVID world. But Tonya talked a lot about community as well as Anthony, and I want to kind of turn the questions that you asked them and turn it on to you, and just sort of simply ask, how as, a duo, as musicians, as people who ask composers to write music, how do you think about community? How do you think about your music creating community? So yeah, that's a simple but probably hard question.
I can start, sure. I feel fortunate that I think we both went to schools, actually, that connected us with a lot of great colleagues who were in school. And then, of course, these conservatories or universities, train each generation of musicians, and everyone, depending on their jobs or other opportunities, are spread all over, well, I was going to say the US, but all over the world, really. And as we are pursuing our careers professionally, we start trying to connect the dots with these people who were, in school together once. And then I think through that, we were able to work with a lot of really great composers and fellow musicians who are in other places, who also managed to build their own communities in each of these different places. And through them, I think we just meet more and more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny since, the arts is our profession. We tend to think about it a little bit differently. But for a lot of people, like, arts are such an important way to convene, right? Like, when you get together with people, you're going to the movies, you're going to see a concert, you're going to go to a museum. And I think it gives an occasion to bring people together very often. And I think something that we think about a lot as we're thinking about prospective collaborators is it's really important to us to work with people who are really kind and really reliable. I think oftentimes in the arts we can have artists who can be a little bit focused on themselves or their career, which is understandable when there's so much scarcity in the world. You have to kind of fight for yourself, but we've always made it a priority just to work with people who we knew were going to be like really beautifully invested in projects and had a really big heart, as you could hear from Anthony and Tonya. And that's been really meaningful to us, and it's often just led to situations like this, where the conversation kind of ripples out. It's like, when you drop something in a pond and the ripples kind of spread. That's always been our practice, and I think it's been an important part of it.
I have to give shout out to a fellow colleague of ours. Her name is Miki Sawada. There are artists like her, but also particularly her as well, who dedicate their career, their work as an artist, as sort of ambassador to different communities. So her specific project, it's called Gather Here. It started out as Gather Here Alaska, where she literally rented a U-Haul van and loaded it up with a little upright piano. And the mission is to go to all these smaller communities. First of all, it was in Alaska, that does not have a lot of resource or connection to, like, concert halls or artists. You don't
Very rural.
Yeah, you don't see the New York Phil traveling to, I don't know, Fairbanks or, but even smaller communities than that. But then she brought the music specifically to them. They're two people who's never heard classical music before. And then I think those people were just, a lot of them felt a unique connection to something they never heard before. So there are artists like that I feel like particularly inspired by their work. I feel like that's community building right there through the arts, quite literally. Yeah.
I think, listening to the two of you speak and thinking about, Tonya and Anthony, at least at BCNC at the Pal Arts Center, we have a program called Residence Lab. And the idea is that something you, Wei-Han, sort of what you were talking about, it's not only just bringing arts to other people, right? It's thinking about how sort of quote unquote normal people or people who are not or don't consider themselves artists or composers actually can be and are, right? They can create art, they can participate in the creation of art, and is actually plays a really important role in terms of Anthony talked about memory, right? Remembering what community was like or what it should be like, and things like that. But sometimes there shouldn't always be the dichotomy, I guess, between professional musicians and kind of everyday people, right? I think the city of Boston went through a cultural planning process a few years back, and part of it was to really kind of democratize this idea, like conception of creativity and arts. But if you have comments on that, but I'll throw out a question, but thinking about representation, Anthony, the two of you talked a little bit about the representation of Asian and Asian American artists in classical music. But I'm curious how the two of you think about that. Wei-Han talked about how he's an immigrant from Taiwan, grew up in a different cultural context. And Zach, I'm assuming you grew up here in the United States. So I'm curious how that kind of impacts your work, how you think about commissioning work, and maybe specifically, I'm really interested for your concert in a couple of days, how did you think about putting together that program, which have, I think Asian American artists, but also other composers?
Yeah, so I mean, I think right, we're just two people, right? So we don't have an institution. It's not like we have things like hiring policies or employees or like public policy positions on things the way that a larger institution would. We work within institutions like that, but we as two people are not. So the place where we really have influence and what is within our sphere of influence are the works we play and what we publicly stand by. And by extension, the way resources travel, right? Like who gets paid, who gets money, who gets sort of acclaim. And so we try to be really thoughtful about that. And for so long, like we just grew up steeped in this kind of conservatory training that is like very homogenous. But especially when you're working with living composers, it's so easy. The bar is so low. There's so many people who are alive who are making incredible work. And to not do it is a choice, right? Like to not engage with this question, it almost feels intentional. And so that's where we try to put a lot of emphasis. We also try to think carefully about the communities that we're going to be embedding ourselves into when we're performing. So here at CMCB, our three largest demographic groups are Hispanic, Asian American, and Black or African American. So it was really important to us. For example, we have a composer from Nicaragua, who's influenced by everything from bebop to flamenco music to visual art. We have Valerie Coleman, who wrote a work that's a reference to Maya Angelou. Valerie Coleman is a Black woman, actually a close friend of Lecolean Washington, our executive director. And that project is very much, there's some sort of like integration and assimilation in the project. It draws on a variety of cultural references. And then we're also working with two Asian American artists who we commissioned, who made new work just for us. And then we're playing a more canonical work by Aaron Copland. That's a 20th century work. So, I mean, I had this very telling exchange once with someone who is a woman, who's a composer, and she was like, yeah, I didn't know that was a thing women did until after I was in college, because I had never actually been to a concert where one of the pieces was written by a woman. Like, I knew it was conceptually possible, but like I had never actually seen that in my life, so I didn't think it was a thing that I ought to be doing. And this is, when I was in high school or something, and it really struck me. And so it's something we've always prioritized.
Yeah, there's been a few articles in the New York Times about Asian Americans, Asians in classical music as well as composers. There was an article, I'm trying to look it up here, but the idea that one of the composers was saying that the idea of programming Asian American composer amongst something more classical, like Beethoven or whatever, shouldn't always be a surprise. That there's an intention that could make sense, versus just always only programming Asian American or Asian compositions for a Lunar New Year performance, right? So I think it's really interesting, when I looked at your program, to see that diversity and see where there's the overlaps and intentions. I'm curious. I do want to see if people who joined us tonight have any questions for the two of you. Anyone struck by any of the interviews or any of the music, or what Zach and Weihan are going to play on Thursday? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat.
What? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, awesome. Hey guys, I miss you guys. Anyway, I just wanted to ask, what was something that you learned from doing this that surprised you when you were, working on these pieces?
That's a great question.
I don't know if this is a surprise, but then I think I'm always pleasantly find out how generous in spirit all the people we've worked with are. Obviously, Zach mentioned that we're a small entity and we don't have a lot of literal financial resource with us as backup. A lot of our commission grants, monies and resources we rely on application for grants. But then I was always surprised by composers have to make a living as well, right? They make money by writing pieces that people pay them for, but how so many of them are willing to work with us to make the music happen. Perhaps it's below what they usually charge. And I just find that generosity of spirit really humbling, actually.
We still pay people fair wages,
right.
Compared to the New York Philharmonic, we're maybe not quite the same. Yeah. I think for me, it's always fascinating, because when I'm preparing something, I have to work so much from the inside out. So I'm really deep in the weeds on all these small details. It's I don't actually have a sense of the experience of Anthony's piece yet, because we've never performed it. And so it's sort of moving from moment to moment is always a surprise, the hinges between things. I have zero idea what the experience of this thing is going to be for people when they hear it. And that's really weird. We're about to play it in 24 hours. And we played excerpts, but I have no idea how it's going to land. I have no idea what kind of piece it's going to be. As we were programming it, we didn't know where to put it because we didn't really know what it was yet. And I think it will take several times of playing it, I think, before we really understand how it feels in our bodies and how it sounds in the space.
I guess the audience reception is also part of the surprise sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. We were really worried that people were really going to dislike Tanya's piece for a while, but people really liked it. It's funny. What we experience in this airspace is very different than what goes out into the hall.
Yeah, they do say when you're performing, your concept of time is kind of warped. It's totally different than what everyone else experiences in real time. Yeah. So plenty of surprises, I suppose.
That's a great question, though. Thank you.
Good question, Michael. All right, we have Morgan. Morgan, please.
Hi, Zach and Weihan. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I just wanted to say this isn't so much a question, but I'm really struck by the intentionality of what you programmed and thinking about our community and who our population is. And I'm also really excited about the variety of Copeland to like something that's incredibly modern and like really pushing the bounds of like what music is and can be and how we conceptualize it. And I think it's a beautiful program and I'm just so excited about it. And I guess one of the thoughts, and if I did have to like come down with a question here, is kind of which is your favorite to perform of this set of stuff? Is that a scary question?
Well, I can tell you which one's the least stressful, perhaps. I don't know if that's.
Which one's the least stressful?
Probably the Copeland, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah.
Just because, well, I think we just live with it the longest.
That is the longest. Yeah.
But to follow up on your, the diversity of the programming, it actually, I think, something to do with both our mission and also the history of the repertoire a little bit. If you think of other like solo instrument, I don't know, violin or cello, they have historically like a much bigger body works from, I don't know, the classical period to now, all the dead white dudes, Mozart, Beethoven, they all wrote tons of stuff for those instruments. But the flute, not so much, not for flute and piano only.
Well, we have a bunch of like very mediocre works, which people will often play, but they're just like not very interesting.
Yeah.
And so it's this really funny commitment to the canon where it's like instead of working with living composers to do really interesting things, we're gonna play these like kind of weird, boring things that almost sound like Brahms, because that's better than not. And that even as like a child, that didn't really make sense to me. Like I didn't have a framework or a way to talk about it, but like.
But in a way, then we're not chained to
exactly
those composers you hear about all the time. Like here's another Beethoven's 50th, 75th, 200-year celebration, that they do every year. Then we get to pick and choose how we want to diversify our programming and our commissioning. So we sort of use that as an advantage in a way.
I know we're just about time at time, Ben, but could we throw you a question?
Sure. Yeah, we can. Yeah.
So Wei Han also half asked it. I'm stealing half of your question.
No, please,
so
please.
So I think as artists, the risk is that we get in these like increasingly sort of small bubbles, and we're talking to like a relatively small subset of society, especially when you're playing like Western classical music. And like it was so funny to me the other day, I was leaving work and I was taking the bus to the ballet. So I was like going right through Chinatown, and it was so strange to like be in a community that looked like Boston as a whole and go into the space that was like so homogenous and white to make music. We often have these like attempts at, community outreach or, sort of going to neighborhoods we don't usually go to basically. And we have decades of evidence that this isn't really working so well and often causes more harm than good. But you are the head of an organization that is doing all kinds of amazing community building and community-based work around the arts. So I'm wondering, if you were to have a megaphone to broader arts communities, what advice would you give to how to do the kind of community-based work you're doing really well so that people feel included and made part and made whole of this sort of like artistic experience that you mentioned that you have at the POW Arts Center?
Simple but tough question. Zach. I think, it's something that I do personally. I feel like I have done through my work throughout my career, whether I'm engaging with a young person, an older adult, a major donor, right? It's just seeing everybody as, someone as an equal, as another human being, right? And understanding that person, has very, very similar experiences as I do, in terms of feelings and, hopes and dreams and kind of all of that. And, I think there's an equalizing, approach. Some people call it sort of being, a cultural humility or being, open. But sort of that sense of, this person may look different, this person, dress different, have had some different experiences, but in probably more ways than not, very similar. Just as that as a baseline, I find that that's an easy way to then, whatever differences there may be, it's easy to perhaps overcome them and understand, someone just as, a friend. So I think that's just, a general approach. I mean, I think, in terms of the arts community specifically engaging with maybe communities that have been kind of on the outside historically, yeah, again, I think that cultural humility and willingness to listen. I mean, I think the artists that we've worked with, even if they're Asian American or come from a certain ethnic, background, typically, I think, are in the community listening and creating art at the same time. I kind of mentioned that residence lab type of program. We've also had artists in residence who've come, and again, they've come into this role as a creator, but really their inspiration has been the stories from the community, the history, the cultural legacies, the journeys of immigrants, etc. And it's kind of the meeting of minds, right? Is taking those stories, incorporating in their, visual art, in their musical art, in their choreography, and bringing those stories to life, right? I think, maybe as a final comment, one of the things, I have a 4-year-old son. We watch a little bit of Disney, and Disney, I think, has, whether they really truly have gotten it or not, or they have a more economic bent, but they've had a couple of movies come out. Encanto, which you may be familiar, is a story about a Colombian family. They just have this movie called Turning Red, which I haven't seen yet, is about a Chinese Canadian family or a young person. And this idea is that there's so many stories, right? You sort of talked about, Zach, there's this mediocre flute and, piano works, by maybe somewhat famous white Western composers, but actually, if we listen to the voices of today, actually there could be much more really interesting, creative, music and work. And so I think that spirit of, what's happening today, who can we talk to, when it comes time to program concerts and repertoire, you can engage, wider audience, and, kind of the more traditional audience, I think, can get really excited about what's happening. So, hopefully that's helpful to hear. And I think goes back to the two of you for doing that and living that. And that's exciting. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. This is so great. We so appreciate you having you here and all the work you do over at BCNC. And we hope to see you all on Thursday.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and have a great one.
Have a good night.
Thanks.
Oh, there's one more comment.